Would like to welcome you all on the impact investment between myths and realities. We are going to speak in Arabic because we are in the ARE, the Arab Republic of Egypt, and most of the attendees are Egyptians. But there is simultaneous interpretation, fortunately, into English.
I would like to welcome Ms. Morgan Simon, our distinguished speaker today. I would like to introduce her. She's the founding partner of Candide Group. She has close to 2 decades of experience making finance a tool for social justice. In that time, she has influenced over $150 billion and is a regularly sought out expert on impact investing. She has a book. Her first book is Real Impact, The New Economics of Social Change. I'm sure you wrote a copy for me. I hope. Has been featured everywhere from Harvard Business School to the United Nations. Prior to Candide Group, she was the founding CEO of Tonic, a global impact investment network, and also founding executive director of the Responsible Endowments Coalition, educating and organizing over 100 campuses across the country. In her volunteer capacity, she's a co-founder and board chair of Transform Finance. She has her BA with high honors in economics and political science from Swarthmore College and serves as an adjunct professor in the graduate program at Middlebury College. It is a pleasure to have you at ECS. I would also like to introduce our very important discussant and old friend and colleague, Dr. Ali Aouni. Dr. Aouni is professor of practice at the business school and director of the John Gerhard Center for Philanthropy, Civic Engagement and Responsibility in Business at AUC. He teaches operations management at the undergraduate and MBA level. And prior to joining AUC, he was the head of the QIZ, Qualifying Industrial Zones Unit at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, Egyptian government, and partner in charge of supply chain consulting services at KPMG Hazem Hassan in Egypt. Aouni has extensive management consulting, software systems development, and operations research experience in the USA, focusing on supply chain management and business logistics improvements. He holds a PhD in operations research from North Carolina State University. أهلا بيك. Okay. قبل ما نبتدي أنا دايما بحب لأي حد.
Before we start and when we have a guest attending for the very first time, we usually try to give them an idea about the strategic orientation of our center. We want to achieve sustainable development on good foundation. It must be based on social change and economic efficiency. Both are of paramount importance for sustainable development. If any of these foundations or cornerstones are missing, we're going to miss sustainable development. This is at the heart of impact investment, which we are speaking about today. Having said this, now we're going to start with the presentation of Madam Morgan. Madam, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry that I know about 5 words in Arabic. You'll hear them all probably by the end of this morning. But thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be at the center, and thanks to the Gerhard Center as well for facilitating the visit. And many thanks to the translator, who I hear is doing a great job. So I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about impact investing, and really to give. We'll do 3 things today. So going through the history of why impact investing, what's the problem that we were trying to solve? And my sense is that all of us are united here in the room in looking for social and environmental progress, right? And what are the ways that we achieve that? And there's the continuum of philanthropy to investing, of what was failing in philanthropy to lead us to this moment. Is it better if I might stand? That might be easier for everyone. Okay. I've mentioned to some, and for those who've read the book know, my father is a musician. He's been in the same band for 50 years. And performance is a big part of our family tradition, right? So knowing that if you can't see something, you can't engage. Exactly. I'm not going to sing. But who knows? Who knows how the afternoon goes? But definitely want to make sure that we can be connected with each other. So really, what was happening in philanthropy? That it is, as much as philanthropy can do some really amazing things, of what are its limitations, both from an individual and from a business perspective, and how can impact investment improve on that? What has impact investment been doing in the world? And then what are some of the challenges that impact investment is going to face moving forward? So if that works as a kind of basic outline, we'll take it from there. And this is really based on, I've been doing impact investing for about 18 years now. And with that, working largely with high net worth families. So Candide Group, just to give a bit more of the background, I invest on behalf of, it's essentially a couple different members of the seventh wealthiest family in America. So one of the historic wealth families that's very concerned with social progress. And then also on behalf of a number of foundations and institutions that are looking to do impact investing. So let me, which button to go forward? The bottom one? Okay, great. So we're going to start by looking backwards. Why did impact investing come about? What were some of the challenges in philanthropy that we were looking to shift? So there were a couple main problems with philanthropy that I want to discuss. The first, so when I'm talking about the revolution, I don't mean the Egyptian revolution. I'm referring to this book, which was actually funded by the Ford Foundation about a decade ago by Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. And it was this idea, have people heard the expression before, the nonprofit industrial complex? That it came about, actually it's imitating the phrase, the military industrial complex, the idea that nonprofits get set up with a very specific structure that limits their activities, that limits their ability to have transformational social change. And this is in part because, and what this book goes through is the history of foundations in the US. And that foundations were mostly set up to be tax shelters, right? Not necessarily about social change, but about saying for wealthy families, if I still want to control my wealth, then I can sit on a foundation, right? Rather than Ford Motor Company, I can be part of Ford Foundation, right? Which no longer is a family foundation, which now has transitioned to professional management, right? But at the time, the idea was that family members could continue to influence how their wealth was being driven, whether the Rockefellers or whatever family it might be. And that meant that wealthy families traditionally were not that interested in challenging the social order, right, and necessarily changing inequality if it served them. And that meant when you looked at what was getting funded, that it was often really quite limited, right? So arts organizations like the ballet or the opera, but not necessarily as concerned with social change. So when you looked at what percentage, if you throw out a guess, what percentage of philanthropy was funding social justice work, real like transformation? Pick a number. 15? 50? 50? Any other guesses? So it's much lower, right? Only 12%. And that means that most of that money is really kind of maintaining the current social order, right? So it's not a surprise that over the years, we have more and more money, more and more billionaires in the US and globally committing their money to philanthropy without a lot of change, or with a lot more inequality, if anything, as opposed to less, right? Why is that? You would think it would go the opposite direction. And the conclusion of this book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which I highly recommend, and you can get it for free online, actually. There's PDF versions for free. The conclusion was that social movements needed to raise their own resources, that they couldn't just be dependent on foundations. But the challenge with that, if you're a social movement in a community, how can you earn resources, right? It's not that easy to do. And the conclusion was just, well, we should have more bake sales and block parties, but you can only sell so many cupcakes, right? To be able to have the quantity of resources that you would need to really transform society. So that's challenge number one, right? That philanthropy just can't cut it in terms of the volume of resources that we need for social change. The second challenge, that philanthropy is really a drop in the bucket. That when you look at global capital markets, right, 196 trillion circulating in the economy every day, and this is even just US foundation giving, right, at 3 billion a year, it's tiny. So if you have all these challenges that are happening in the global economy and then this tiny bit of philanthropy that's fighting back against it, we're locked in this David and Goliath fight, and it makes sense that we don't win, right? So there's another author, Unni, if people have heard the book Winners Take All, that's quite good. One of his emphasis is we often talk about giving back, right? The importance of giving back. But maybe we should think more about not taking, right? Of how do we make sure, for instance, if we are able to pay living wages to people, then they won't need to access a food bank or need to get affordable housing because they'll just have enough money to live, right? So it can't just be philanthropy, but really looking at what's happening in global capital markets and how we can leverage that for change. Then the third challenge that foundations or other philanthropists, we work at Crosspurposes, that we're fighting poverty with one hand tied behind our back because we donate money towards a solution at the same time that we're investing in the problem. So when you look at something like the Gates Foundation, you may be familiar with their work globally, they'll support health programs, for instance, over 200 million in looking at a number of the health challenges that have come out of the oil industry. And at the same time, they're investing twice as much money into the companies that cause the problems. So if you invest twice as much into the problem as you do into the solution, don't be surprised when you don't win, right? And that's where we see when foundations are investing most of their money without that regard to the mission, that we wind up really losing. And I want to invite people, if there are any questions that arise as I'm speaking, and I know I'm often speaking about US institutions, I'm happy to share more global examples as well, but if any questions come up or comments on how this would apply better in the Egyptian context, just please feel free to jump in so we can have a conversation together. So impact investment arose as a potential solution to these challenges of saying that we can have investments intended to generate social and environmental impact beyond the financial return, so that we're not just thinking about how do we give away money to solve problems, but how do we invest money to solve those problems too. So then that means that we're able to use all of those resources, those 196 trillion, right? Rather than just thinking about the little bit of philanthropy that we can all do, how do we leverage all the resources that we have for a greater future? So how I actually started out in this work, and part of why I've been doing it so long, was working through my college's endowment. So my college was $1 billion institution, and I figured it was probably the only time in my lifetime that I was going to be a billionaire, and started filing shareholder resolutions, so challenging corporations to shift their practices in how they were treating their workers, right? So providing equal opportunities to all. And that work led to founding the Responsible Endowments Coalition, which was working on, it's $450 billion that colleges and universities control in the US. And I think we often think about wealth as being with individuals or perhaps with corporations, and we forget sometimes that it's institutions, right, that we all have some connection to, whether it's your alma mater, wherever you may have studied in the globe, whether it's a pension fund, whether it's banks, but that it's not always about individual wealth, but it's how we connect to these institutions. So we formed chapters on 100 campuses across the country, really working on how those endowments and schools, I think often colleges and universities are at the center of saying, we want to be responsible actors, we're going to be good to the environment, we're going to be really thoughtful about generating students with a social conscience, so why not through your investments as well? And that was really my introduction into the investment field. And then moved to found Tonic, which was a community of really Silicon Valley investors, so the original venture capitalists and angel investors who had been doing traditional investing for decades and wanted to apply those same techniques to social enterprise. So that was about 100 investors, about $3.5 billion between them, that were looking to mostly support early stage social ventures all over the world. So we formed chapters in Africa and Latin America, and I was looking at about 500 deals a year as a result, and we were doing about 30 transactions a year. And people may have heard of GIN, the Global Impact Investment Network, which was kind of the institutional version of TONIC. Now, what's funny, GIN is an acronym. TONIC was just a joke. So we named TONIC so that the two leading institutions in impact investment would be GIN and TONIC. That's absolutely a true story. But with that, really looking at, between the two organizations, the incredibly wide variety of institutions that can do impact investing, right? So there's groups like Shell, because they're looking at renewable energy opportunities where they have venture activities seeking early stage renewable companies. You have foundations like the Ford Foundation that's committed over $1 billion to impact investing. You have colleges and universities that are similarly doing this work. And then individual angels becoming much, much more part of practice. So in my time leading these two different networks over the course of the decade gave me the opportunity to really deeply contemplate this word impact. And how do we make sure that we get it right? And one of the things that I find fascinating when you think about the word impact, this is the Merriam-Webster definition: to impinge upon or make contact, especially forcefully. That doesn't sound good, right? Would you want to be impinged upon? So I think we often assume that impact investing, impact always has to be positive, but we're imperfect human beings, right, that are constantly trying to figure out what is good, what is bad. And just because we say that something is agriculture or energy or microfinance or investing in women, that you have to really think about what's the long-term impacts in any particular intervention to know if you're doing the right thing, right? So that's, I think, some of the challenge that we have as a field is how do you identify and how do you define impact ultimately really being a crux of the challenges that we have. And why is this so important right now? So mainstream institutions like JP Morgan have projected up to $2 trillion in investments for the global poor over the next decade, a number of those destined for Africa, which, as that comes to pass, that's 10 times as much as official development aid, right? So the way that a number of countries have been used to experiencing development has rapidly shifted, and people being expected to be able to start businesses where in the past they would have started nonprofit organizations, right? So that landscape has been shifting rapidly under people's feet, and then also the question of who gets to be engaged in that process. How do we make sure that it's accountable to people who don't have access to MBAs or to some of the business tools to be able to do this sort of work? So when we look at impact investing and where we are so far, I'd say that there's 3 questions that we've answered very effectively. So can it be market rate? And market rate meaning if I put money into enterprises that have a social and environmental value, will I make just as much money as I would anywhere else? This is obviously a critical question, whether for your individual balance sheet or corporation or institution, you need to be able to depend on the resources that you have. And that's where we've seen studies from Harvard Business Review to Deutsche Bank to very mainstream institutions absolutely proving that you can do as good, if not better, through impact investing. And it makes sense that most of us ultimately are long-term investors, right? When we think about how, particularly in public markets, how corporations get valued, the idea that you're addressing returns on a quarterly basis doesn't make sense. I don't know if anyone in the audience is planning to retire in the next quarter. If so, congratulations. It's wonderful to be at that point in life. But most of us are thinking maybe it's 20 years down the line. Maybe it's I'm trying to preserve wealth for my grandchildren, right? So when you have, in the case, for instance, companies like Shell, who at points in time have said, well, we only have 8 years of oil reserves. That's a challenge if you want to retire in 30 years, right? That does beg questions of how are you diversifying? How are you thinking about the real financial impacts of climate change? So to be clear, some of the first investors who started to raise questions about climate change weren't the environmentalists, weren't the hippies. it was the insurers, right? It was insurance agencies like Swiss Re that were saying, we're concerned that companies that don't have a credible plan for climate change are going to be in trouble, are going to experience significant financial trouble. So we're not going to insure a company that doesn't have a climate change plan, right? So we're seeing this real rethinking about concepts of risk in business, that it is too risky to ignore the social and environmental consequences of your activities, whether or not you care about people, whether or not you care about the environment, right? Simply from a financial bottom line perspective, this has become an imperative. And it also means that companies, this was one of Harvard Business Review's studies over a 30-year period, finding that companies that had superior social environmental policies significantly outperformed the market, right? 3 times as much capital appreciation. So that's, not appreciation, but value on the markets. So these are some of the opportunities that people have to say, yes, we can fulfill our values, but we're also going to make sure to make the money that we need to make. Second main question, is it an asset class or an approach, right? JP Morgan 10 years ago, when they came out with their approach, their first report on impact investing, they said, impact investing, the new asset class. And all of us in the industry were like, no, don't call it an asset class, right? Because the point is you can use it for cash, for public equities, for fixed income, for private equity, for real estate. That whatever type of asset we're talking about, there's a way to apply a social and environmental approach. And that some of my work has been taking portfolios that are in, $100 to $400 million portfolios that we've been able to move from 0 to 100% impact investing across all asset classes. So it's not something where you have to say, oh, I'll just do it with 5% of my money or 10% of my money. If you want to be socially, environmentally consistent with all of your money, that is available to you, right? Because the industry has matured enough to have opportunities in all those different asset classes. And that's part of how we've answered this third question, can the impact industry scale, right? Is this just going to be a couple of pet projects, or is this going to be a real approach? And that's where we've seen really the mainstream integration, whether for high net worth individuals, but also at the retail level. The idea that people with $1,000 can walk into a bank or look for an ETF or other forms of financial instruments and get access to impact investments. So I would say in the first 10 years, we've really been able to prove our success in the financial industry. But then we get back to this question of, well, what's impact, right? Are we actually doing the right things, or are we going to be the impinging upon movement? And that's where, We'll get to a moment in terms of what are some of the questions for the next decade, but I think they're really around impact. I just wanted to spend a minute first on really where we are. So you started to see in this transition to impact investment beyond just screening out of bad companies to proactive investments in the early 2010 beyond. With kind of over time, you see this progression, right? And that there's been just really every year doubling, tripling in terms of the assets that are being applied with an impact investment approach. And then globally, beyond that, you see 1 in every $5 that's under institutional management has some type of social or environmental screen. So whether people know it or not. So this gets into, as we're scaling, some of the questions that I think we have for the next decade, right? And one of the things that we've really proven as an industry when we come together to say, we're going to prove a point, like, yes, we can be market rate, we're able to get it done. So what are some of the next questions that we need to focus on? So are we going to create gradual or transformative change? I think a lot of what we've seen is this question of, are we just going to make it a little bit less miserable to be poor? Are we just going to make it, 30 years instead of 20 before we all die from climate change, right? We're dealing with some really urgent issues. And how do we make sure that we're really shifting economic systems in a deep enough way to get to the future that we want to get at, right? Before we have water crises, before we wind up with so much mass migration as there's a desertification right across Africa and otherwise. So how do we really look at transformative level impact? Second, in order to do that, how do we balance our skill set between social and financial expertise that we often have? We've been really happy to see that many people from the financial sector have wanted to jump into impact investment, but don't necessarily have the social background, right, of making sure to bring along the anthropologists and the community development specialists, and how do we, or the environmental scientists, right, of how do we make sure that we're getting that sort of exposure and not making guesses about other people's lives, right, and their futures, and making sure that people get to be active parts of that conversation. And that goes to point 3 of building an inclusive industry, of making sure that we have perspectives of the global poor that are really leading the conversation rather than making those assumptions, of making sure that we have access to capital available to people from all different backgrounds. That people may have heard, you know, I come from California. I'm in Oakland, which is adjacent to Silicon Valley. So it's Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Oakland are kind of in a triangle. And there's a lot of talk when you're starting a business, which is, I think, a global phenomena, the idea of friends and family. People know that expression. It's the idea that, you know, you want to start your business and people say, okay, to raise your first money, go to your friends and family and ask them for money, right? So depending on the friends that you have and the family that you have, you may be able to get the capital you need, or you may be able to only raise 50 pounds, right? It really depends where you're from and what sort of access you're going to have to economic resources. So how do we make sure that it's not just people from wealthy backgrounds, right? One of the things that we say often in the US is that intelligence is evenly distributed across a community, but opportunity is not. Right? So how do we make sure that that opportunity is really provided to the broadest range of people as possible? Because you have 100 million citizens, right, who have so much potential, so much entrepreneurial energy, but not if they can't get access to capital, right? That winds up being one of the major limiting factors. So this winds up really, for me, creating this meta question of who's going to get to set the agenda for impact investment, right? How do we make sure that it's inclusive of all these different areas of society, and particularly the people being impacted? Because what we've learned is that when we try to make decisions for other people, we often fail, right? That we're making judgments about what people would want, and that often can really create negative outcomes for everyone. And I want to I'm gonna give a couple examples of impact investments gone very right and gone terribly wrong, to give a sense of what that can mean, right? Because I think sometimes we get told, oh, this is an impact investment, it must be good. But when is that really true? So picture that you're sitting in your office, getting investment opportunities in your box, or me sitting in California. And there's a wind energy project that's going to be established in rural Mexico. It's one of the poorest parts of Latin America and of the country. And it's going to get 20% returns, dollar denominated. It is going to, in doing renewable energy, help this nation lessen their fossil fuel dependence, lessen their carbon exposure. It's going to create jobs for low-income indigenous people. Sounds pretty good, right? Would you invest in that? Maybe. If you're getting more than 20%, I'd love to know where you're investing. So this sounded, we thought this sounded pretty good, right? The idea that we could make good returns while having a good social and environmental impact, and so did the Inter-American Development Bank, so did Siemens, so did a lot of global institutions who were supporting the project. It was a great idea for everyone, except for the people who live there. So this sign in Spanish, fuera los transnacionales de país, get out of the country. We are completely against the wind corridor. Now that's interesting, right? We're used to seeing protests against oil and gas, maybe. We're used to, in the case of land grabs, but wind energy, right? People out protesting wind energy, this was very odd. And it was because the people who had put together the investment didn't bother to ask the local people what they wanted, right? Sort of made an assumption that they would be happy to get jobs and not worry about what the long-term impact was. And that contracts were being signed in Spanish rather than the local indigenous language. People often didn't know what was going on. And they were being offered $50 an acre for their property, which on a $500 million investment project, right? So being offered absolutely nothing. And when people realized what was happening, that they were really getting taken advantage of, they started putting up roadblocks and protesting and ultimately blocked the project from proceeding, which some people would say is a victory for society, right, in terms of protecting the people. But it was really a loss for everyone, right? Investors lost literally hundreds of millions of dollars. You had people losing their lives was the other, that you had paramilitary forces coming in, and there were a number of deaths of these protesters. And then it came to the point where the indigenous peoples and the local government essentially put out the statement, "Stop the intimidation, hostility, and violence generated by wind energy." Now that's strange, right? As an impact investor, the last 3 words I ever want affiliated with my name are hostility, violence, and intimidation, right? And it goes to show that if we're not thoughtful about how we're implementing impact investment, we can really wind up with some serious problems. And this, to me, pointed at this story in general, some of the broader problems that I was observing after a decade in the industry. So that we have times where, as much as we're seeking to really create that return, that we have to make sure we're not receiving our profit at the expense of communities, right, of doing it on someone else's back. And we often talk about this question of, is your investment extractive, right? Is it taking from people, or non-extractive, right? Are we giving back to communities more than we take out? Are we making sure that impact is not just defined by the investors, right, of us sitting on the 10th floor kind of looking down and thinking, what is it that people want, but that the people we would see as the beneficiaries really getting to have a vote at the table. And then finally, as I mentioned before, that idea of a capital gap, right, of how do we make sure that there's opportunities for people to even get to try out on projects. And this led me to 2 things. One was to found the nonprofit Transform Finance, which tries to build a bridge between community organizations and social justice and finance, right, of how do we make sure that both sides are talking and learning from each other. So that's transformfinance.org. And then Candide Group, which is a registered investment advisor in the US. We deploy about $30 million a year towards impact investments. We have about 70, just over 70 investments in our portfolio, and really trying to follow that non-extractive principle of saying, how is it, can we make sure with every investment that we do, that we leave more in the community than we take back out? So to close, just to kind of point to where we can go, I wanted to share the 3 principles of Transform Finance that we try to follow in our investment practice, and some of the examples of the sorts of social enterprises that we feel are really kind of putting this more community-minded face onto impact investment. So I'll take us back to that community in Mexico, where after seeing really the devastation, the potential devastation from this wind project, the community came back together and said, okay, we get it. We're not opposed to wind energy per se. Wind energy is actually a fantastic thing for our community, but we don't like outsiders taking control of our land. So what if we could do this as a partnership, right? What if we could contract with a major company to do the installation, raise the money, and have our own wind farm? And we can still pay investors a great return, right? But because it's ours, then we can make sure that we support community. And then they had to decide, well, if we do make this money, then what are we going to do with it? And they voted that they would create a pension fund for the elders, because one of the main challenges in that community, there's a lot of migration to the United States because people are so poor, right, that they can't afford to pay for food, clothing, shelter for their grandparents, right? They want to make sure that the elders are taken care of. So the idea of creating a community resource essentially owned like a cooperative, where then everyone would be entitled to have a retirement resource at the end of it. So they started Yansa Group, and this is essentially to create a community-owned and managed wind farm, and really correcting those challenges on the lack of community engagement. And that's really following, so the first Transform Finance principle of engaging communities in design, governance, and ownership. So not just as the beneficiary, but actually as the protagonist in these sorts of projects. The second principle, adding more value than we extract. So I've mentioned a couple of times the idea of non-extractive finance, which was really founded by the guy in the black shirt, Brendan Martin there. And his idea was, if people who historically do not have resources are given an investment, right? And we all know businesses sometimes succeed, sometimes fail. And the challenge with debt is that even if you gave it your best effort, right, you might have followed someone else's business plan, you can lose your home, right? You can lose any assets that you might have rather than really being a partner. So he's been partnering with cooperatives. So these are now the 17 worker owners of a windows factory in Chicago, new era windows and doors, where then anything that they make is shared in terms of the investment returns between the investors and the community members. So now you've turned 17 workers into business owners in a way that really creates an asset for their community and their family. And then the final principle we try to follow is really balancing risk and return between investors, entrepreneurs, and communities. So making sure as investors, we're not just thinking about what's our risk and how do we reduce our risk, but what's the risk on communities that are participating in these projects as well. And Uncommon Cacao, they work globally, oh, sorry, that was an accident, both throughout Africa and Latin America in finding cacao sources. And cacao is one of the most poorly paid commodities in the world. And even in the fair trade system, farmers typically only get 2 cents more a kilo, right? So really difficult to live on. And what's interesting is that you're now seeing the large global chocolatiers, they're concerned that farmers don't even want to grow it anymore, right? That they're abandoning the crop because it's so poorly paid. And Uncommon Cacao said, rather than just paying a poverty wage and calling it good enough for those people, let's make sure they're getting at least half of every transaction that we do, right? And that's part of how do we make sure we're structuring fairness into our enterprises, that we're paying a living wage, that they're getting their fair share of the profits. And then still as investors, that we have an opportunity to make money within that. So those stories I tell in much more detail in the book, in really trying to flesh out what are the ways that we can use impact investment as a tool for community empowerment. So thank you for the opportunity to just share some of the highlights in terms of the field and where we've gone. I'm pretty easy to contact if there's any specific questions that come up. But I think we do have some time for Q&A to kick things off. So thank you.